November 1944. Somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, for thousands of men packed deep in the cargo holds, the war is over. They are the survivors of Normandy, of the Falaise Pocket, of the Siegfried Line. They are German soldiers, Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine. They are prisoners of war. Their journey has been one of fear and confusion. Captured on a continent collapsing into fire and ruin, they were processed, tagged, and loaded onto these ships. They carry with them more than just their winter greatcoats and the few possessions in their pockets. They carry the certainty of their world view. They know what to expect. They are, after all, prisoners of the Americans. The decadent, culturally hollow enemy their Führer has assured them is on the brink of collapse. Their propaganda, perfected by Dr. Goebbels, has painted a vivid, consistent picture. America is a nation torn by race riots, crippled by Jewish bankers, its factories silent, its people starving. The U-boat blockade, they were told, had been a stunning success. New York, they heard, was a blackened shell, its skyscrapers toppled by long-range bombers that never existed. They brace for what comes next. A barren camp in Canada, a frozen wasteland, a journey into starvation. They expect hatred. They expect desperation. The first crack in this certainty is the silence, the lack of cruelty, the methodical, almost boring efficiency of their captors. And then, after weeks at sea, a new smell on the wind. Not the salt and diesel of the crossing, but land. The men come on deck, blinking. They stare. This is the first great shock. There is no rubble. There are no bomb craters. There are no skeletal, burned-out buildings. The city, New York or perhaps Boston or Norfolk, is whole. At night, it is not dark. It is a galaxy of light, blazing in defiance of a war that, here, seems to exist only in newspapers. The prisoners murmur to one another, This is a facade. It must be. A trick. An elaborate stage play. They've been sailed past the one part of the city they bothered to rebuild, a Potemkin village of skyscrapers to fool them. They are marched off the ship, not into ruins, but onto paved streets. They see civilians. The civilians are not in rags. They are not thin. They look annoyed. Annoyed at the traffic. Annoyed at the delay caused by a column of prisoners. The prisoners are herded toward a train station. They see the cars. Not military trucks, but civilian automobiles. Hundreds of them, thousands. More cars in one harborside parking lot than they had seen in all of occupied Paris. If you think you've seen every illusion of war, stay with this one. What they were shown next wasn't a facade. It was a weapon more powerful than a tank division, and it was designed to break their minds. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy, born from a new kind of warfare. By 1944, the United States was facing a logistical and ideological challenge. It held over 300,000 German prisoners on American soil, with more arriving every day. By the war's end, the number would climb to over 425,000. The Geneva Convention dictated their treatment. They must be fed, housed, and kept from harm. But American military intelligence, specifically the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office, saw an opportunity. This was not about conversion. It was about demonstration. The German Lanzer, the common soldier, was tough, disciplined, and even in defeat convinced of his own systemic superiority. He believed he was fighting for a new world against a decadent old one. The American plan was not to argue with this belief. It was to shatter it, simply by showing him the truth. The architects of this plan were not propagandists in the traditional sense. They were sociologists, psychologists, and logisticians. They understood that the most powerful ideological weapon America possessed was not a leaflet or a broadcast. It was America itself. And so, the journey began. The prisoners were not flown in secret to isolated camps. They were put on trains. Often these were standard passenger trains, sometimes even comfortable Pullman cars, simply with guards posted at the doors. And for days, they watched. From above, the illusion of a nation at war held. From the ground, the reality of a nation at work was terrifying. The prisoners expected to see a hollowed-out continent, its resources drained by the war effort. Instead, they saw the factories. They rolled past the great industrial heartland, past Detroit, past Chicago, past Pittsburgh. They saw the River Rouge plant, a mile-long city of steel and fire, pouring out bombers and tanks. They saw factories that stretched for acres, their chimneys breathing smoke, their parking lots filled with the private cars of the workers. In Germany, a private car was a luxury for a party official. Here, it was a tool for a factory worker. The prisoners, many of whom were mechanics, engineers, and factory workers themselves, did the math. They understood, in a way no politician could, what this capacity meant. This was not a nation struggling. This was a nation flexing. And still, the train went west. For one day they stared. This, they told each other, was the industrial core. It was impressive, yes, but it must be the only one. For 2 days they grew quiet. The factories had been replaced by fields. This was the second shock. The food. They saw fields of wheat and corn that seemed to have no end. They saw herds of cattle that numbered in the thousands. This was not a country starving under a blockade. This was a country that could feed itself, its armies, and its allies, and still have more to spare than Germany had at the start of the war. In their letters home, censored but still revealing, they wrote about this. "You cannot imagine the scale," one Oberleutnant wrote. "They are not growing for survival. They are growing for surplus." The recurring symbol of this impossible abundance was not grand. It was small. It was what happened in the dining cars. The prisoners were fed 3 times a day. The food was simple, but plentiful. It was the same food given to the American soldiers guarding them, and this is where the worldview finally broke. They were given white bread, butter, real coffee with real sugar, jam, meat. In wartime Germany, white bread was a memory. Coffee was a roasted barley substitute called Ersatzkaffee. Sugar was rationed by the gram. Meat was a holiday miracle. Here it was just Tuesday. The true, soul-crushing moment, recounted in dozens of post-war memoirs, was not what they were given. It was what they saw thrown away. A guard, finishing his meal, might leave half a sandwich. A cook, cleaning the galley, might scrape a pan of uneaten potatoes into a bin. To the German prisoners, this was not just waste. It was a spectacle of power so profound it bordered on the obscene. This was a country that threw away, without a second thought, more food than a German family might see in a week. The arguments in the cars changed. "It's a trick," the hardcore Nazis insisted. "It's poison. They are fattening us up." Or "It's a show." But the show never ended. "You cannot fake this," a logistics officer from the Afrika Corps would counter, gesturing at a passing grain silo, one of dozens. "You cannot build this. You cannot feed this. We have been lied to." This was the ideological shift. The gap between what they knew to be true and what they saw to be true had become an unbridgeable chasm. The war was not just being lost on the battlefield. It was already, mathematically, historically lost before the first shot was even fired. The climax of the journey was the camp itself. The prisoners were marched into compounds that, compared to the frozen hell of the Eastern Front or the bombed-out barracks of Germany, were practically civilian. They had hot showers, clean barracks. They were issued new clothing. There were libraries stocked with books. There were theaters where the prisoners put on their own plays. There were sports fields where they organized entire soccer leagues. And then there was the final, devastating proof of the propaganda's lie, the post-exchange, the PX. Following the Geneva Convention, prisoners who chose to work on local farms, in factories, non-munitions, or within the camp itself, were paid a small wage in scrip. They could spend this scrip at the camp store. A German soldier, a veteran of Stalingrad, could walk into a shop inside his own prison camp and buy Coca-Cola. He could buy cigarettes. He could buy magazines, soap, razor blades, and ice cream. Ice cream. This was the moment of total intellectual surrender. This was the hidden contradiction laid bare. The enemy they were told was weak and decadent was in fact so powerful that it could afford to provide luxuries to its captives in the middle of a total war, 3,000 miles from the nearest front line. The American re-education program, which involved showing films and providing newspapers, often printed specifically for the camps, was secondary. The real re-education had happened on the train. It had happened in the dining car. It had happened at the site of a parking lot. The truth as a weapon was precise. For the die-hard SS and Gestapo prisoners who were often held in separate, stricter compounds, it had little effect. They dismissed it as a trick, as Jewish-led decadence that proved their point. But for the vast majority, the farmer, the baker, the student, the mechanic who had been conscripted, it was definitive. It didn't just end their will to fight, it ended their reason to fight. America had not defeated them with cruelty. It had defeated them with an untouched skyline. It had crushed their ideology with a sandwich. When the war ended, and these men were finally repatriated, they returned to a homeland that was truly, finally, the rubble they had been promised. They returned to the starvation they had escaped. They brought back with them a story that no one in Germany could believe. A story of a magical, impossible land across the sea, a place of endless factories and mountains of food. A place that could not possibly be real. What looked like a simple transport of prisoners was, in truth, one of the most effective psychological operations of the war. The silence on that journey west was not the sound of defeat. It was the sound of a worldview collapsing. It was the sound of history being rewritten, not by a gun, but by the quiet, undeniable evidence of the truth. And in that abundance, they outthought an empire. Stories like this remind us how imagination, and sometimes just the simple, unadorned truth, reshapes history. If this one moved you, there's another waiting. The next illusion was even stranger. It wasn't about revealing the truth. It was about building a lie so vast it saved thousands of lives. And it worked.